Trump never expected this ending. What was supposed to be a triumphant story of rescue patriotism and political theater has instead turned into a cautionary tale. Imagine the scene: families of white South African farmers, once surrounded by the wide horizons of fertile land boarding flights with nothing but luggage and hope. They had been promised homes, jobs, and security in America, the safe haven that Donald Trump declared he would provide. Cameras followed them at Johannesburg's airport. Their faces carried a mixture of fear and anticipation. To Trump's base, this was more than immigration. It was the symbolic protection of whiteness, a powerful message wrapped in political drama. But the story didn't unfold as scripted. Instead of stepping into suburban houses or newly prepared farms, many of these families found themselves abandoned in cheap motels across small-town America, jobless, penniless, trapped in a land they were told would embrace them, but instead left them invisible. The very machine that fast-tracked their arrival now refuses to take responsibility for their future. This raises painful questions. Was this ever about humanitarian concern, or was it simply a political stunt designed to feed America's culture wars? How could families who sold everything, land, heritage, entire legacies, become pawns in a global stage play that left them broken and humiliated? And what does this reveal about the way power manipulates narratives of victimhood, turning them into weapons for political gain? Ladies and gentlemen, in this video, we're going to uncover the untold truth behind Trump's so-called rescue mission. We will trace its roots in South Africa's history, the propaganda that amplified it, and the bitter reality of those who believed it. If you believe truth matters more than propaganda, please share this video. And if you want to continue receiving deep, untold stories about Africa and its place in global politics, subscribe now and join us on this journey. To understand how this story began, we have to go back more than a century to the soil itself. In 1913, South Africa's government passed the Native Land Act, a piece of legislation that stripped black South Africans of their right to own most fertile land. It forced them into reserves, barren and overcrowded, while the richest agricultural regions were reserved for white settlers. Over decades, Afrikaner families, descendants of Dutch, French, and German colonists, built vast estates. These lands were not merely farms, they were dynasties handed down through generations. Even after apartheid officially ended in 1994, inequality in land ownership remained staggering. White South Africans, though only a fraction of the population, controlled much of the country's most productive farmland. For millions of black families, the promise of land reform remained just that, a promise unfulfilled. Against this backdrop, something changed in the mid-2020s. A narrative began to circulate not in the farmlands of Limpopo or Free State, but across the digital airwaves of the United States and Europe. Far-right blogs, talk shows, and social media accounts began pushing the claim that white South African farmers were being hunted, targeted for extermination in an orchestrated campaign. Elon Musk himself added fuel to the fire, tweeting about farm murders and giving the story a global spotlight. The reality was far more complex. Yes, South Africa struggles with violent crime. Yes, farmers, white and black, have been victims of horrific attacks. But the numbers showed a different truth. Statistically, black South Africans were far more likely to be murdered. There was no state-sanctioned campaign to wipe out white farmers. But in politics, perception often outweighs fact. Donald Trump seized on the narrative. For him, it was more than foreign policy, it was theater designed for a domestic audience. By portraying white South African farmers as persecuted Christians in need of rescue, he sent a signal to his base: America would protect its own idea of civilization. At rallies, in interviews, and on Twitter, Trump painted Afrikaners as an endangered minority. He announced a new asylum program tailored just for them, a door flung open at the very moment refugee admissions for Syrians, Afghans, Sudanese, and other war-torn populations were slammed shut. The contrast was impossible to ignore. For people fleeing bombs in Aleppo or famine in Sudan, America had no room. But for white farmers from a stable democracy, suddenly there were promises of visas, housing, and security. To many observers, it was less about compassion and more about race and politics. Still, for some Afrikaner families, the program seemed like salvation. The first flights departing Johannesburg's OR Tambo International Airport were covered breathlessly by international media. Cameras captured families pushing heavy luggage carts, children clutching stuffed animals, parents gazing into the distance with anxious hope. They had liquidated their assets, sold farms that had been in their families for generations, and told neighbors they were leaving for good. One such man, Charles Kleinhaus from Limpopo province, told reporters his land had been threatened with seizure. He claimed he faced danger at home. Under Trump's program, he wasn't required to provide hard evidence. His testimony was enough. Yet later, South African records revealed no government attempt to seize his land, no police reports of threats, and no expropriation orders. That detail alone exposed the weakness of the asylum system it relied on, stories not proof. The Expropriation Act in South Africa only allowed land seizure after failed negotiations, and it had rarely been used. There was no wave of forced confiscations, but by then the families were already on planes believing they were escaping persecution. And so the stage was set. In the eyes of Trump's administration, this was a victory, a chance to showcase protection of a supposedly endangered group and to frame America as the savior of civilization. For the families, however, the journey was only beginning. What awaited them in the United States would be far different from what they had been promised. When the first Afrikaner families touched down in the United States, the moment was staged like a triumph. Reporters crowded the arrival gates, snapping photos of exhausted parents and children clutching passports. Their journey was framed as a modern-day exodus, a people rescued from persecution by the most powerful country on earth. But as the cameras turned away and the headlines faded, reality set in. Instead of neatly prepared homes or farms awaiting cultivation, the families were shuttled into cheap roadside motels. Entire households, sometimes 4 or 5 people, were crammed into a single room. They were given no jobs, no long-term housing, and no clear path to stability. Parents scrambled to find food, children missed school. Families who had once commanded hundreds of acres of land now found themselves queuing at local shelters, reduced to begging for groceries. On online forums for South African expatriates, desperate messages began to appear. A mother pleaded that she couldn't afford milk for her children. A father wrote that his family of 5 had been living off donated canned food for weeks. Some admitted openly that they regretted coming at all, but returning home was nearly impossible. Most had sold their farms, closed their businesses, and severed ties. To go back would mean not only financial ruin, but also public humiliation, admitting that the persecution claims they had broadcast were exaggerated, even false. One case stood out: Charles Kleinhaus, who told the press in Limpopo that his land was under siege. Yet South African government records showed no evidence of threat seizures or expropriation. For him and others, the truth was devastating. They had gambled everything on a promise that crumbled the moment they arrived. Pride now trapped them as much as circumstance. To admit they had been pawns would mean acknowledging their complicity in the political stunt. And make no mistake, this was political theater. Trump's administration had rolled out the red carpet for Afrikaners. At the same time, it was slamming the door on refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Sudan. The contrast could not have been sharper. Brown and black families fleeing war were told no, while white families from a relatively stable democracy were ushered in with promises of protection. To critics, this was proof of racial hypocrisy at the heart of U.S. immigration policy. Back in South Africa, reactions ranged from disbelief to outright mockery. Jonathan Jansen, a respected academic, called the program a slap in the face to black South Africans who had suffered genuine dispossession under apartheid. For many who had lived through systemic exclusion, the idea that Afrikaners, the historical beneficiaries of apartheid, were now being cast as its victims was absurd. Newspapers ran biting editorials, social media filled with sarcastic posts. So the masters of land theft are now the persecuted. History has a dark sense of humor. In the United States, too, skepticism grew. Human rights observers highlighted the lack of credible evidence behind the claims of persecution. Analysts pointed out that the asylum process for Afrikaners was expedited based on personal testimony, while thousands of legitimate asylum seekers languished in detention centers or were turned away at the border. To many Americans, this wasn't about saving lives. It was about feeding a narrative of white victimhood to energize Trump's political base. And yet, for the families stranded in motel rooms, politics offered little comfort. Their suffering was real. Parents watched as savings evaporated. Some took menial jobs they would never have considered: back home cleaning offices, mowing lawns, working night shifts as security guards. For people who once represented South Africa's landowning elite, the fall was not only economic but deeply psychological. They were no longer privileged landowners, but anonymous immigrants struggling to survive in a country that quickly forgot about them. This was the turning point, the climax of the story. What began with television cameras and triumphant rhetoric collapsed into silence and shame. The Afrikaner families had been promised safety and prosperity, but instead they became living proof of a larger hypocrisy that this asylum program was never truly about rescue. It was about propaganda. The consequences of Trump's rescue mission did not stop at the motel doors. They rippled outward across the lives of the Afrikaner families themselves, the society they left behind in South Africa, and the politics of the United States. Each layer revealed deeper wounds. For the families who took the gamble, life became a cruel paradox. On paper, they were asylum recipients protected under U.S. law. In reality, they were stranded. To remain meant enduring poverty, isolation, and a future without dignity. To return meant acknowledging that their persecution claims had been exaggerated or fabricated, something that could expose them to charges of fraud in the United States and humiliation back home. Many were locked into a psychological prison of pride. Having declared themselves victims of persecution, they could not simply reappear in South Africa as failed opportunists. For the children, the toll was especially harsh. Pulled from schools in South Africa, they were left adrift in the U.S., struggling to adapt in underfunded public classrooms while their parents searched for low-wage work. An entire generation was caught in the fallout of a political spectacle they never chose. Back in South Africa, the asylum program was viewed with contempt. Here was a group that had historically benefited from apartheid's theft of land, now rebranded on the global stage as its victims. Black South Africans still waiting for meaningful land reform watched the drama unfold with disbelief. The irony was too sharp to ignore. Those who once excluded millions from fertile land were now being presented as the dispossessed. Scholars like Jonathan Jansen argued that the policy was not just misguided but insulting. It undermined genuine struggles for justice by elevating a false narrative of white victimhood. Politically, it fueled resentment and deepened mistrust. Many South Africans began to see the U.S. less as a neutral global player and more as a partisan actor willing to distort history for its own domestic agendas. The credibility of American foreign policy in the region took a hit. In Washington, the asylum program revealed the double standards baked into immigration politics. At the very moment the administration slashed refugee quotas for war-torn nations, turning away desperate families from Syria, Sudan, and Afghanistan, it opened a special fast-track lane for white farmers from a functioning democracy. The message was unmistakable. Compassion had a color. For Trump's base, the program reinforced a powerful story that whiteness itself was under siege globally, and America had a duty to defend it. But for critics, it was blatant hypocrisy. It exposed how immigration policy could be weaponized not to protect the vulnerable, but to perform a cultural script that played well in rallies and campaign ads. The fallout was not confined to rhetoric. Advocacy groups pointed to the Afrikaner asylum as evidence that the system was broken, more responsive to political theater than to humanitarian need. Diplomats in Pretoria bristled at the insinuation that their government was unable to protect its citizens, calling the program a fabrication designed to score political points abroad. The episode strained U.S.-South Africa relations, creating tension at a time when Washington was already struggling to maintain influence on a continent increasingly skeptical of Western intentions. In the end, the consequences were layered but connected. For Afrikaner families, it was the loss of dignity and future. For South Africa, it was insult and division. For the United States, it was the exposure of racialized hypocrisy in its immigration system. What had been sold as rescue revealed itself as exploitation, and those who paid the price were the very people it claimed to save. From Washington to Pretoria, the Afrikaner asylum program became a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about race politics and the way narratives are weaponized in the modern world. In the United States, this policy was less about South Africa and more about America itself. By creating a program specifically for white farmers, Trump crafted a story that resonated with his political base, a vision of whiteness under siege not just at home, but globally. This was political theater at its purest. The plight of Afrikaners was not measured against statistics or verified evidence, but against the emotional needs of an American audience already primed for grievance. Critics in the U.S. quickly pointed out the hypocrisy. Refugee caps for war-torn nations were slashed. Families from Afghanistan and Syria fleeing bombs and famine were turned away. Yet for Afrikaners, a fast-track door swung open. The message was unmistakable. Compassion was selective, tied not to suffering, but to skin color and political usefulness. For many Americans, this policy exposed the fragility of their immigration system, revealing how easily it could be bent to partisan theater. Internationally, the program sparked outrage. In South Africa, it was seen as a cruel inversion of reality. Afrikaners who for centuries had benefited from the dispossession of black South Africans were suddenly cast on the world stage as persecuted victims. Commentators asked how could those who once controlled the land, the banks, and the levers of state power now claim the mantle of the oppressed. To many, this was an insult not just to history, but to the ongoing struggles for justice and reform in South Africa today. The policy also strained diplomatic ties. South African officials rejected the insinuation that their state could not protect its citizens. Editorials mocked the United States for falling for a narrative built more on ideology than fact. For black South Africans still waiting for land redistribution, the message from America was clear: your suffering is invisible, while the discomfort of former beneficiaries of apartheid is headline news. Beyond the U.S. and South Africa, the asylum program resonated globally. It became an example of how powerful nations manipulate stories of victimhood to serve domestic politics. To countries in the global South, it was proof of Western double standards. Leaders in Africa and Asia noted how easily America could bend facts to reinforce its internal culture wars. The program eroded credibility, painting Washington not as a defender of human rights, but as an architect of selective compassion. Meanwhile, human rights observers warned of the dangerous precedent. If asylum could be granted based not on evidence, but on narrative, what stopped other nations from using immigration as propaganda? In Europe, far-right groups pointed to the Afrikaner case as justification for their own racialized rhetoric, while critics feared it legitimized a dangerous global trend where suffering was measured not by human need, but by political convenience. In the end, the Afrikaner asylum program told the world more about America than it did about South Africa. It revealed a nation willing to exploit global narratives for domestic theater, even at the cost of real human lives. For the families stranded in motels, the price was personal. For the United States, the price was credibility. For the world, the lesson was sobering: propaganda travels faster than truth, and its victims are often the very people it pretends to save. What began as a story of rescue ended as a lesson in betrayal. For the Afrikaner families who boarded those flights, the dream of a new life in America collapsed into the cold walls of cheap motel rooms. Their tragedy is not just personal, it is political. They were pawns in a game designed to sell a narrative of white victimhood to American voters. And once their usefulness expired, they were abandoned, invisible to the same machine that had paraded them before cameras. But the consequences go deeper than the fate of a few families. This episode is a warning to all of us: beware when politics dresses itself in the language of compassion. Beware when leaders exploit human suffering not to heal it, but to score points. Today it was Afrikaners. Yesterday it was refugees from Syria, Sudan, or Afghanistan. Tomorrow it could be anyone, any community whose pain can be molded into propaganda. For South Africans, the insult cut especially deep. Those who lived through apartheid know the true meaning of dispossession. To see the historical beneficiaries of that system rebranded as persecuted victims on the world stage was not just ironic, it was cruel. And for the rest of Africa, this story is a reminder that global powers will not hesitate to manipulate the continent's realities to serve their own politics. This is where we must ask ourselves the hard questions. Do we still believe that leaders act out of genuine concern, or are we ready to accept that narratives are crafted to manipulate emotions? Do you think the Afrikaner families were true victims, or were they complicit in a political stunt that turned against them? And looking beyond this story, when we see headlines about Africa or about any vulnerable people, can we afford to take them at face value? Or must we dig deeper, question harder, and demand the truth? Friends, if there is one lesson here, it is this: propaganda has victims, and those victims are real families, real children whose lives are shattered while powerful men play their games. Please share this video if you believe truth should always come before theater. Comment below, were these families betrayed, or were they simply blinded by their own privilege? And subscribe to our channel if you want to hear more untold stories about Africa, about leaders like President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, and about the global struggles for sovereignty and dignity. Because the world deserves the truth. And truth, my friends, is more powerful than propaganda.